We are going to be taking a look at data annotations. This week, we will be using them for model binding and validation. We're also going to take a look at how they are used in controllers. They are attribute classes that live in the system component model.data annotations namespace. There's actually two different using statements that we will be bringing in to our models. One of them is using system component model.data annotations. The other one is using system component model.data annotations.schema. Most of the data annotations that we're going to use fall under the first one. The ones that fall under schema are the ones that modify our table structure. Okay, and between those two using statements, we pretty much will be handling all of our data annotations. And data annotations are typically used for data validation. They are used to override code first conventions. And some of those conventions that we have seen so far would be for the helper to use the property name as a label in our forms. And we can use data annotations to kind of override that and specify more of a custom name, something that might be a little bit more user-friendly. So we're going to be taking a look at how to do all of that today. The only place that you are going to be using data annotations are the models and the controllers. The HTML helpers that are in your views will use those annotations to help render the view. Okay, but you don't put the data annotations in the views. Okay, it's only in the models, which is where most of your business logic is, and the controllers. So first we are going to take a look at action selectors. They are data annotation attributes that are applied to action methods. So these are in the controller. So we're going to be taking a look at attributes in the controller first, and then we'll move on to the majority of the attributes, which are going to be in our models. Okay, so action selectors basically fall into three different types. There's action name, non-action, and action verbs. Okay, and again, these are applied to the action methods that are in our controllers. So action name lets you specify a new name, which will override the method name. So we have our method names, and if for some reason you don't want to use the method name and you want to override it, action name is how you do it. So we have a very short little controller here with index, action method, and then below that we have get current time, which is also an action method. And you'll notice that we're overriding that name, get current time, with just current time. So current time is the action method that will be used when they key in the URL. Okay, it is overriding get current time. And then we have another little example. The delete confirmed action method name is being overridden by delete. And you'll notice that it's being overridden when a form is posted, okay? Because this is inside HTTP post. So when the form has posted, then the action name delete is going to be used. Okay, and I should mention the same code is going to be executed. Okay, it's just that where the control is going to go after the delete confirmed form posts is here using the name delete. So basically delete is just an alias if you want to look at it like that. Non-action. So this is kind of like using your action method as like a little routine that you're calling. A non-action method cannot be directly accessed by the public. So you cannot key in the action, the controller and the action method on the URL. It is an action method that can be called internally by other action methods. And so that is what this example is showing you. So we have a little index action method, and then we have our current time. And so for this is the home controller. So to get into this, they would do /home/current time, and then it would run through here. And you'll notice that we are calling time string. Time string is the non-action method. So this is only used internally. You can see we're calling it here. It's going to run through this code. It's going to return this little message about the current time, returns it to this location, which again does another return statement. And because this is a string, it's just going to display it on the screen. Okay, but that is what a non-action method does. It is not meant for public access. It is something that you access internally. For action verbs, we have already been using these. The two that you can use are HTTP GET and HTTP POST. HTTP GET is basically anything that is up on the address bar. Okay, that's the default. HTTP POST is the result of posting or submitting a form. Okay, so the default is GET. So if you don't put any attribute, it's going to assume GET. And POST is something that you have to enter. And then with POST, it is assuming a form. You can also have forms submit with GET. If you have method equal GET in a form, then the data is shown up on the URL. And then you would use HTTP GET for it. Okay. Otherwise, when you submit a form, it's going to use POST and it's going to be hidden. Okay. And if you submit using POST and you want something done when the form posts, then you have to put the attribute of HTTP POST here. And we have been using HTTP POST for several weeks, so you guys should be familiar with it. Here is a little example, and you can see that we have two different edit action methods. The first one, it will execute automatically, and it is pulling in an ID from the address bar. The second is only going to execute when the form, the edit form, submits. So basically, the first one, they're entering an ID on the URL, and they're retrieving that particular student's data. Okay, and that's what this little link statement is doing. It's got, and you can kind of see the SQL-like code here, because it's basically looking in the student table where the student ID is equal to the ID that was entered. And it's basically retrieving the first row that it encounters where that is true and displaying all of that in the view. Okay, and then once the form posts, which means they did make a change, then it's going to come through this little section of code. And basically it just updates the database, and we'll see some code later that'll do that. And then it redirects to the index. The MVC framework supports quite a few different action verbs. The two that we're really going to be using are HTTP GET and HTTP POST, which is form handling. There is also HTTP PUT and HTTP DELETE. Those are typically used with jQuery and Ajax. And you can see PUT restricts an action method to only handle HTTP PUT requests, and DELETE restricts an action method to handle only HTTP DELETE requests. So basically you kind of use it the same way you do POST, right? It's only going to go through the action method if the PUT or DELETE was executed, and those are really only going to be executed in jQuery or Ajax. Okay, and then you've got one called HTTP options and HTTP patch, and you can kind of read about those. The only ones, again, that we're going to be using are GET and POST. Just be aware that there are additional ones that you can use, and in case you're curious, I did include a link to those. This brings us to model binding. And basically model binding is a bridge between the HTTP request and your C# action methods. It makes it easier for you to work with data in your forms, which are in your views, because the POST and the GET automatically transfer data into the model, or they transfer the data from the model into the form. So it's kind of handling all of that, the data transfer aspects of ASP.NET MVC. So in order for you to kind of get a feel for what this is doing, we're going to go through some different examples. First, we're going to take a look at binding to primitives. So you can bind to primitive values, which are basically your input parameters, and you can also bind to complex data types, which would be classes. So in this little example, where we're entering the ID, it is then using that ID to retrieve the student data. And when it retrieves the student data, MVC is matching that data up with the model. And here it is, we are telling it that the ID is the student ID. So it's matching that up as well. Okay, and it's mapping out those values. Now, if we had something like this with the ID and name, it would map ID to the student ID, it would map name to the student name, and then if we had it retrieve data, it would map the remaining properties. When you have MVC map to your parameters, like ID and name, that is called binding to a primitive data type, right? Because it's not a class. You can also bind to complex data types, which would be classes. So in this little example, this is a little different than how our Contasso University looks. We have a student class, and we also have a standard class. And in the standard class, we have an ID and a name. And then you can see in the student class, we also have an ID, we have a student name, age, and then we bring in a standard class object. And this object includes standard ID and standard name. Okay, so this is in the model. And then we get into our controller. And we have an edit action method. And you can see that we are bringing in a student object. And we're calling it STD, short for student. And so what it's doing is it's then connecting that object, STD, with all of the properties in our student model. So it's connecting STD with the ID, the name, the age, and here we're specifying only one of our standard object values, which is standard name. And you can see that we have to prefix it with standard dot, and then we're grabbing standard name here. So STD is our student object. Then we've got dot standard, which is the property that represents our little standard class. And then we're getting the standard name property from that. Okay, so we're basically populating this. Then, because it's an edit, we would have code in here to update the database, and then we would redirect to the index. So MVC automatically binds the form data to all of our student properties. Now, there is another way that you could retrieve values from the form. The first technique we just looked at used the class object to bind the data. And the second method is actually using the form collection data type. Okay, so you can see in this little example, we have our data type as form collection instead of the class, and we're calling the collection values. And then we are subscripting in with our properties into values. And that is what is doing the binding to the various variables that we're creating. And then we're using those variables to update the database. Okay, so two different ways to do it. How do I normally see this done is the first method, using the student class to create an object. So we have talked about, can I recap here? Binding to primitive types and binding to complex types. So another thing that you can do in the controller is to say which properties you want to include for binding and which ones you want to exclude. So if you do not want to deal with the entire class, you can specify which ones you want to use or which ones you don't want to use. So here we have that same student class that we were looking at before. And our example is assuming, this first example, is assuming that the form has been submitted. And you can see we have a bind attribute, and in parentheses, we're telling it what we want to include. So we're including the student ID and the student name only. Okay, and this prefixes the name of our class, which is student, and our object. Okay, and then you can see that we're pretty much only using student name here. We're doing our update, and then we're redirecting to the index. And then our second example is basically saying exclude age. So this bind exclude age precedes our class, which is student, and our object. And so we would not be able to retrieve or update age here. And in the previous example, the only two that we'd actually be able to include would be ID and name. Typically, if you're going to do an edit, you are going to include everything. Okay, but if there was some reason that you needed to exclude or include specific properties, you are able to do that in MVC. So kind of to summarize how this binding process works. We have our request, HTTP request, which is going to be get or post. Then all of the values are collected, and the model binders are used to populate the values, which we then use to update the database. And that's done in the action method. So we populate the values, go to the action method, update variables, update our database, typically redirect back to an index. So the whole concept of the model state is kind of important when you get into updating. And updates include adding new data or new rows, deleting rows, and editing or changing the data within a row. And it's only going to allow you to make changes if the model state is valid. And that is something that you need to check in the controller. Now, what would cause a model state to return that it is not valid, to return false? So model state that is valid is going to return true if everything is peachy. Model state that is valid is going to return false if there are errors. What causes errors? Typically, they are validation errors. You will be adding data annotation that provides validation to ensure your data is accurate. And if the user enters data that violates your rules, then model state is valid, it's going to be false, which means they're going to be returned to the view and they're going to have to fix the error. So a couple different ways you're going to check this. You can see we have a create action method here, and it's going to run through this code if they have filled out the create view and submitted it. So they're trying to add a row. You can see that we have the bind attribute, and we're looking at course ID, title, and credits. So we have our course class, we have an object called course, and then we're checking if model state is valid. If that is true, that means there's no errors. So then we do db.courses.add. Courses here with a capital C because that is our class, .add, and then in parentheses we have course, which is our object. Okay, so we are adding a row. Then we are saving that changes to our table, and then we are redirecting to the index. What happens if the model state is valid, tests false? Well, if that tests false, then we return them to the course view because they need to fix the error. Okay, so in this second example, we are also checking to see if the model state is valid. This second example is for an edit. So with an edit, they have maybe been looking at an index, and for one of the rows, they click on edit, and then that data is populated into the form, and they make a change and submit it. Okay, and we're still dealing with the course here. So you can see that we've got action method of edit. The bind here is only going to include course ID, title, and credits, which are the three things you can change in the course model. We have our course class, a course object, and then we check to see if the model state is valid. Okay, and then we are looking at the state of the course object. Okay, so are there errors? Okay, if there's no errors, we get into here, and that means it's good. So we set the state to EntityState modified, and then we save the changes. Okay, and then we redirect to the index. So model state is valid, no errors. We set the state to basically modified, save it, and redirect. If the model state is not valid, there are errors, we return them to the view. So the entity states are important, and this is basically the state of the changes that you are making. So whatever you are doing, whatever CRUD function you are doing, where are you at in that process? Because that is your entity state. So there are 5 different states that an entity can be in. And then once you save the changes, there are 4 different states after the changes have been saved. So prior to saving, your entity can be added, which means that you're ready to put it into the database, but it's not been added yet. So it does not exist yet. So you're on the verge of saving this new data. There is unchanged, which means you did nothing. So you brought up an edit and you didn't change anything and you hit save, something like that, okay? Nothing has changed. There's modified, where you brought up an edit and you did make some changes. There is delete, where you have marked it for deletion, but nothing has happened yet. It has not been removed or detached from your table. And detached means the entity is not being tracked. This happens after you save a deletion. Okay, so added, unchanged, modified, deleted, and detached. Those are all the different states prior to saving. And then after you save, then if you were doing an add, the entity is inserted. And then basically it becomes unchanged after the save is complete. So you add it, and then the status goes to unchanged because the addition has already been made, and it kind of resets the status. Same with modified. So when you save those editing changes, okay, you've done the update, then basically that state goes back to unchanged. And deletion, what happens with those is the entity becomes detached from the context because it's not supposed to be there anymore. And if you didn't make any changes, then it's still in the unchanged state. So if you brought up an edit, tried to save it with no changes, it just remains unchanged. Okay, so these are all the different aspects of data annotations that you can specify in the controller. And the next video is going to talk about the model related data annotations.